Tonight, we descend into the shadows beneath a medieval battlefield, not to the clash of swords above, but to the cold, silent earth below. Our story follows a sapper, a digger, a man with calloused hands, lying on his belly in the dark, scraping through soil and stone by torchlight. He's part of the siege, but not with a blade. His weapon is silence, his battlefield is a tunnel, and his job is to bring down a wall from underneath it. It's a story of patience, danger, and dirt, of cramped lungs and creaking timbers, and the terrible knowledge that the next breath might be your last. Before we begin, if you enjoy these slower, more thoughtful glimpses into forgotten corners of the past, consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps us keep these stories coming. And here's something for the comments tonight. What kind of historical job would you have hated most? Would you crawl through tunnels, swing a hammer, or run messages through battle lines? I'd love to hear your answers. Now breathe in slowly. Feel the damp earth, the hush of war above, and the heartbeat of a man buried in his work, and drift quietly into the past. The earth has always spoken to me in whispers. Even now, decades later, when I close my eyes and let my weathered hands rest upon this wooden table, I can still feel the cool dampness of clay between my fingers. I can still taste the metallic tang of underground air, thick with the scent of minerals and ancient roots. The memories drift back like morning mist, soft and persistent, carrying me to those long months beneath the walls of Château de Montclair. It was the summer of our Lord's year, 1347, though time moved differently in the darkness below ground. Days blended into nights, and nights into days, marked only by the changing of the guard above and the rhythm of our careful, patient work. I was young then, barely past my 20th year, with hands still smooth enough to feel every grain of sand, every pebble that passed through my fingers. My father had been a sapper before me, and his father before him. It was in our blood, this understanding of stone and earth, this knowledge of how foundations hold, and how they might be convinced to let go. When Lord Geoffrey's army arrived at the gates of Montclair that warm June morning, I was among the engineers called forward. The castle stood proud and defiant on its rocky outcrop, its walls thick as a man is tall, built by masons who knew their craft well. I remember standing in the commander's tent that first evening, studying the rough drawings spread across the campaign table. The parchment crackled softly under the weight of small stones placed at each corner to keep it flat. Candles flickered in their brass holders, casting dancing shadows that made the lines of the castle walls seem to move and breathe. Sir Edmund, our chief engineer, traced his finger along the eastern wall, speaking in low, measured tones about angles and approaches, about the depth we would need to dig, the breadth of our tunnels. The work would take months, he explained, perhaps until the first snows. We would need to dig deep beneath the castle's foundation, following the natural grain of the rock, feeling our way through limestone and clay. The tunnel would need to be wide enough for 3 men to work side by side, tall enough for a man to stand upright, strong enough to bear the weight of timber supports, while we carved away the very bones of the castle above. That first night, lying on my straw pallet beneath the stars, I felt both excitement and a deep, settling peace. This was my calling, this patient work beneath the earth. While other men fought with sword and lance in the bright heat of day, we would wage our quiet war in darkness, inch by careful inch. There was something sacred in it, I thought, something that connected us to the ancient builders who had first shaped stone and mortar, who had understood that all great things begin with a foundation. The morning we broke ground, dew still clung to the grass around the castle's base. I remember the soft scrape of our spades against soil, the way the earth yielded at first, dark and loamy from seasons of rain. The other sappers worked alongside me in comfortable silence, men who understood that this work required patience and contemplation. There was Thomas, grey-bearded and steady, who had spent 30 years reading the language of stone. Young Willem, barely past boyhood, who listened more than he spoke, and learned faster than any of us expected, and Marcus, whose gentle hands could feel a crack in rock from arm's length away, whose quiet wisdom guided us through the hardest decisions. We began our tunnel at a distance from the castle walls, hidden among a grove of oak trees where the morning shadows fell long and deep. The entrance was modest, just wide enough for a man to descend with his tools, carefully concealed beneath woven branches and scattered leaves. To any watching eye from the castle walls, we would appear to be ordinary soldiers making camp, tending to routine tasks of siege warfare. But beneath the surface, we were already beginning our slow journey toward the heart of Montclair. The first weeks were a meditation in earth and stone. We dug through soil that told stories with every layer, dark earth rich with the decay of countless autumns, then clay that held the memory of ancient seas, finally reaching the limestone bedrock that would guide our path. Each handful of earth that passed through our fingers spoke of time beyond human memory, of seasons and centuries flowing like water over stone. I learned to read the tunnel walls like pages in an illuminated manuscript. The limestone revealed itself in bands of cream and grey, marked here and there with the ghostly impressions of creatures that had lived when this land lay beneath warm, shallow seas. Sometimes, by the light of our oil lamps, I would run my fingers over these fossil patterns, marvelling at the delicate spiral of an ancient shell, the branching coral that had once swayed in currents older than memory. The work fell into its own natural rhythm. We would descend before dawn, when the air was cool and still, carrying our tools and oil lamps down the narrow ladder we had built into the tunnel mouth. The descent always brought a sense of entering another world, leaving behind the concerns of the surface for something deeper and more enduring. Below ground the temperature remained constant. Neither the heat of summer days nor the chill of morning frost could reach us here. Our lamps cast pools of golden light against the tunnel walls, creating an intimate space where 4 men could work in harmony. The sound of our tools against stone became a quiet percussion, chisel strikes and hammer blows that echoed softly through the darkness ahead. We developed our own unspoken language, a gesture here, a touch on the shoulder there, ways of communicating that respected the contemplative nature of our work. Thomas taught me to listen to the stone itself, to hear the subtle differences in sound that told us when we were approaching a crack, when the rock was solid, when we were getting close to open space. He would press his ear to the tunnel wall and close his eyes, his weathered face peaceful in concentration. Sometimes he would nod and smile, as if the stone had shared a particularly interesting secret. Other times he would frown and signal for us to change direction, trusting in knowledge that came not from books or maps, but from decades of patient listening. The limestone we worked through was soft enough to carve, but strong enough to hold its shape, a perfect balance that made our progress steady but never rushed. We removed the stone in careful blocks, each one examined and set aside. The finest pieces we would keep for repairs to our tunnel supports. The rest we carried up in leather buckets, distributing the spoil so carefully that no watching eye would notice the gradual accumulation of stone dust and chips. Willem had the keenest eyes among us, able to spot the hairline fractures that might become problems later, the subtle colour changes that indicated different types of stone. He worked with a focused intensity of youth, but gradually learned the patience that our craft demanded. I watched him discover what I had learned years earlier, that rushing this work led only to mistakes, that the tunnel would reveal its secrets in its own time, according to its own ancient logic. Marcus served as our engineer and philosopher both, sketching rough diagrams on scraps of parchment by lamplight, calculating angles and weights with the same care that monks brought to copying scripture. He understood that our tunnel was more than just a hole in the ground, that it was a living thing with its own structural needs, its own requirements for support and reinforcement. Under his guidance, we built timber frames every few feet, massive beams of oak that distributed the growing weight above us. The castle foundation, when we finally reached it, was a marvel of medieval masonry. Blocks of grey stone fitted together so precisely that a knife blade could barely slip between them, mortared with lime and sand mixed to a recipe that had been old when these walls were new. The foundation stones were larger than those above ground, some of them requiring the strength of several men to move, fitted together with the mathematical precision of a master builder's design. For several days we simply studied the foundation, tracing its outline with our fingertips, understanding how the weight of the entire castle was channeled down through these carefully placed stones. We made sketches by lamplight, measuring and calculating, determining which stones were purely foundational and which ones bore the critical loads that kept the walls above from shifting. The castle builders had known their craft well. The foundation was not simply a platform for the walls above, but an intricate system of interlocking supports, each stone placed to bear and distribute specific stresses. Removing the wrong stone could bring down nothing more than a few loose blocks. But finding the keystones, the ones whose removal would compromise the entire structure, that required patience and knowledge that came only from years of working with stone. As we worked, I found myself thinking often about the masons who had built this foundation generations ago. They had been craftsmen like us, men who understood stone and mortar, who had spent long days shaping each block to fit perfectly with its neighbours. They had built to last, creating something that would stand for centuries, never imagining that other craftsmen would one day work patiently to undo their careful construction. There was no malice in our work, no anger toward those long-dead builders. Instead, I felt a kind of professional respect, even admiration, for their skill. We were engaged in a dialogue across time. Their knowledge matched against ours, their understanding of how to build balanced against our understanding of how structures could be encouraged to fall. It was a conversation conducted in stone and timber, in the careful placement of supports and the precise removal of key elements. The oil lamps that lit our work cast everything in warm, golden light that flickered with each movement of air through the tunnel. The flame light made the stone walls seem to breathe, shadows flowing like water across the carved surfaces. Sometimes, when we paused in our work to rest or to consider our next move, the silence would settle around us, like a living thing, broken only by the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness ahead, or the soft whisper of air moving through passages we had not yet explored. In those quiet moments, I would often find myself thinking about the nature of our work, about the strange intimacy of spending so many hours beneath the earth. Above ground, the siege continued with all its noise and urgency, men shouting orders, horses stamping, the occasional clash of weapons as skirmishes broke out near the castle gates. But down here in our tunnels, time moved differently, following the patient rhythm of chisel and hammer, the careful placement of timber supports, the gradual weakening of stones that had stood firm for generations. There was something deeply satisfying about this slow, methodical work. Each day brought measurable progress. Stones removed, supports positioned, the tunnel extended another few feet toward our goal. Unlike the uncertain fortunes of battle above ground, where a single moment could change everything, our work accumulated steadily, day by day, building toward an inevitable conclusion. The other men felt it too, this sense of working toward something larger than ourselves. We rarely spoke while we worked, but the silence was comfortable, companionable. Each of us understood his role, his particular skills, his place in the larger pattern of our endeavour. Thomas with his decades of experience, Willem with his sharp eyes, Marcus with his engineering knowledge, and myself, learning to read the stone like scripture, finding my own place in this ancient craft. As the weeks passed, our tunnel grew longer and more complex. We discovered that the castle foundation extended deeper than our initial estimates, requiring us to work at a lower level than we had planned. The additional depth made our work more challenging but also more secure, less likely to be detected by the castle's defenders. We were far enough below ground that the sound of our tools would not carry to the surface, deep enough that even the most careful observer could not detect the vibrations of our work. The deeper we went, the more the tunnel felt like a world unto itself. The air grew cooler and more still, carrying scents of deep earth and ancient stone. The walls around us were no longer just limestone, but layers of different stone, each telling its own story of geological time. We found veins of quartz that sparkled in our lamplight like buried stars, bands of darker stone that had been compressed under pressures we could barely imagine. Willem was the first to notice the small springs that began to seep through cracks in the tunnel walls, clear water that tasted of minerals and stone. We channeled these springs into small gutters carved along the tunnel floor, letting the water flow away into the darkness behind us. The sound of running water added another voice to the quiet symphony of our underground world, a gentle murmur that accompanied our work and filled the silences between hammer blows. The springs brought their own beauty to our tunnel. Where the water flowed, small deposits of calcite began to form, creating delicate formations that caught and reflected our lamplight. In some places, the mineral deposits created patterns that resembled frozen waterfalls, stone lace that seemed too delicate to exist so far beneath the earth. These formations grew slowly, adding their own texture to the tunnel walls, making our passage seem less like a man-made excavation and more like a natural cave. Marcus studied these formations with the interest of a scholar, understanding that they told us important things about the rock we were working through, about stresses and water flows that might affect our construction. But I found myself drawn to their simple beauty, the way they transformed our working space into something that felt almost sacred, our underground chapel where stone and water created their own quiet art. As we worked deeper into the castle foundation, we began to encounter the more massive stones that formed the base of the structure. These were not the carefully fitted blocks of the upper levels, but rough-hewn giants, some of them taller than a man and twice as wide. Moving these required techniques passed down through generations of sappers, methods of leverage and support that allowed a few men to shift stones that weighed as much as a loaded cart. We worked with wooden levers, thick as a man's arm, fulcrums carved from seasoned oak, rope and pulleys that multiplied our strength and let us move stones with precision and control. Each massive block had to be studied carefully before we attempted to move it, its position in the foundation analysed, its relationship to the stones around it understood. Removing the wrong stone too quickly could bring down the tunnel roof, burying us beneath tons of rubble. The work required absolute trust among the four of us. When Thomas called for us to position a lever, Willem and I would move without question, knowing that his experience guided us toward the safest approach. When Marcus calculated the angle for a pulley system, we followed his instructions precisely, understanding that our lives depended on his engineering knowledge. When I felt a crack developing in the stone we were working on, the others would pause immediately, waiting for me to determine whether we could continue safely. This trust grew naturally from our shared understanding of the work, from weeks of working together in the intimate space of the tunnel. We learned each other's strengths and limitations, developed ways of communicating with gestures and glances that were more efficient than words. The tunnel became our shared world, a place where four very different men found common purpose and mutual respect. The physical demands of the work were considerable, but not overwhelming. The weight of stones and timber required strength, but it was strength applied with patience and intelligence rather than brute force. The long hours in cramped positions demanded endurance, but it was the endurance of a craftsman, sustained by interest in the work itself, rather than mere determination to continue. My hands grew calloused from rope and tool handles, my back grew strong from lifting and carrying, but these changes felt natural, the body adapting to work that suited its capabilities. The mental demands were perhaps greater than the physical ones. Every decision had to be considered carefully, every cut calculated, every support positioned with absolute precision. A moment's inattention could undo weeks of careful work, could turn our tunnel from a tool of siege warfare into a tomb. But rather than making the work stressful, this need for constant attention made it deeply engaging, requiring the kind of focused concentration that leaves no room for worry or distraction. As autumn approached and the leaves began to turn in the oak grove above our tunnel entrance, we knew we were approaching the climax of our work. The foundation stones we had been gradually weakening were now held in place mainly by temporary timber supports of our own construction. The original strength of the wall had been carefully and systematically undermined, replaced by wooden props that we could remove when the time came for the final phase of our work. The tunnel had become familiar territory, each turn and support beam known to us like rooms in our own homes. We could navigate from the entrance to the working face in complete darkness if necessary, our feet finding the safe path over uneven stone floors, our hands reaching automatically for handholds carved into the tunnel walls. The sound of our footsteps on stone had become as familiar as our own heartbeats, the echo of voices in the tunnel as recognizable as conversation in our own kitchens. But even as we approached the completion of our undermining work, I found myself reluctant to see it end. The tunnel had become more than just a means to an end, more than simply a tool of warfare. It had become a place of learning and discovery, a space where four men had found a way of working together that felt both ancient and timeless. The slow, patient rhythm of our days underground had created its own kind of peace, a respite from the uncertainties and conflicts of the world above. In quiet moments, when we paused in our work to rest or to consider our next move, I would sometimes imagine what would happen to our tunnel after the siege ended. Would it be filled in and forgotten, becoming just another layer in the geological history of this place? Would future builders, working on some unimaginable project, discover our carefully carved passages and wonder about the men who had created them? These thoughts did not sadden me, but rather gave me a sense of participating in something larger than the immediate concerns of siege and conquest. We were adding our own chapter to the long story of human interaction with stone and earth, joining the ranks of miners and builders, craftsmen and engineers who had worked with patience and skill to shape the world around them. The work had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. The long hours of concentration had taught me a kind of mental discipline I had never possessed before, an ability to focus completely on the task at hand while remaining aware of the larger patterns and purposes that gave meaning to individual actions. The physical demands had strengthened not just my body, but my confidence in my own capabilities, my understanding of what could be accomplished through persistent, intelligent effort. Perhaps most importantly, the work had given me a deep appreciation for the collaborative nature of human achievement. No one of us could have accomplished what we were doing together. Thomas's experience, Willem's sharp observation, Marcus's engineering knowledge, and my own developing understanding of stone and structure, these separate skills had woven together into something greater than their sum. The tunnel was not just the product of four men's labour, but the result of four men learning to work as parts of a single, more capable whole. As we prepared for the final phase of our work, I found myself thinking often about the men who would come after us, the sappers and engineers who would face similar challenges in future sieges, who would need to develop their own understanding of stone and earth, timber and rope, patience and precision. The techniques we were using had been passed down from generation to generation, modified and improved by countless craftsmen who had faced similar problems under different circumstances. Now it was our turn to add to that tradition, to discover new solutions and refine old methods, to pass on our own understanding to those who would follow. The tunnel beneath Château de Montclair would be forgotten, but the knowledge we gained in its construction would become part of the larger body of human understanding, contributing to the slow accumulation of wisdom that allows each generation to build upon the achievements of those who came before. The oil in our lamps burned steady and bright, casting its warm light on stone walls that had become as familiar as the walls of home. The gentle sound of our tools against stone continued its quiet rhythm, marking the passage of time in our underground world. Above us, the massive walls of Montclair stood as they had for generations, but beneath them, 4 men worked patiently toward the moment when centuries of careful construction would finally yield to months of even more careful destruction. The work continued, slow and sure and certain, guided by knowledge passed down through generations and refined by our own growing understanding. Each stone removed, each support positioned, each careful calculation brought us closer to our goal. But more than that, each day of work brought its own satisfaction, its own sense of purpose and accomplishment. The tunnel was more than just a passage through stone. It was a meditation on patience and skill, a testament to what could be achieved when human intelligence was applied with persistence and care. It was our contribution to the long conversation between builders and destroyers, creators and engineers, that had been going on since the first human being picked up a stone and wondered how it might be shaped to serve a purpose. In the gentle light of our oil lamps, surrounded by the familiar walls of our underground world, we continued our work, adding our own small chapter to the endless story of human craft and ingenuity. The tunnel grew longer, day by day, inch by careful inch, carrying us toward a conclusion that would change the world above, but leave unchanged the deeper satisfactions of work well done, of problems solved through patience and skill, of 4 men who had found in the darkness beneath the earth a way of working together that honoured both their individual abilities and their shared purpose. The stone walls around us held the memory of ancient seas, the weight of centuries, the careful work of masons long dead. But they also held something new, the mark of our own passage, the evidence of our own contribution to the long story of human interaction with the natural world. In the warm light of our lamps, surrounded by the quiet sounds of patient work, we continued our slow journey through stone and time, guided by knowledge as old as civilization and as immediate as the tools in our hands. The first frost came early that year, painting the oak leaves silver in the pale morning light. I remember climbing down into the tunnel that October morning, feeling the contrast between the sharp autumn air above and the constant, gentle warmth that surrounded us in our underground world. The seasons might change on the surface, bringing their own rhythms of heat and cold, but our work continued in its own timeless pattern, guided by the patient logic of stone and timber rather than the turning of the calendar. We had been working beneath Chateau de Montclair for nearly 4 months now, and the tunnel had become more than just our workplace. It had become our refuge, our sanctuary, a place where the noise and uncertainty of the siege above gave way to the quiet certainties of our craft. The lamplight that guided our work cast the same warm glow whether the sun shone bright overhead or storm clouds gathered in the autumn sky. The sound of our tools against stone created the same peaceful rhythm whether dawn was breaking or midnight settling over the sleeping camp. By now we had removed nearly half of the foundation stones that supported the eastern wall of the castle. The massive blocks we had carefully extracted lay stacked in side chambers we had carved for that purpose, testimony to months of patient, precise work. In their place, we had built an intricate framework of timber supports, oak beams, and pine props that held the weight of the wall above, while we continued our careful undermining. The wooden supports had their own beauty, I thought, as I ran my hand along the smooth surface of a beam that Thomas had shaped with his adze. Each piece of timber had been selected for its particular qualities, its grain and strength, its ability to bear weight or resist compression. The framework we had built was as carefully engineered as any cathedral vault, each member precisely positioned to carry its share of the enormous loads pressing down from above. Marcus had drawn detailed diagrams of our support system, sketching by lamplight on pieces of parchment that he kept rolled in oiled leather to protect them from the tunnel's dampness. His drawings showed not just the current arrangement of beams and props, but the sequence in which they would be removed when the time came for the final destruction. Each timber was numbered, each connection labelled, the whole system mapped out like a musical score that would be played in reverse, dismantling rather than building, bringing down rather than raising up. The knowledge that our careful construction was ultimately meant for destruction gave our work a poignant quality, a sense of beauty that was intensified by its temporary nature. Like the elaborate sand mandalas that travelling monks sometimes created in the castle courtyards, meant to be swept away when completed, our tunnel and its supports were designed to fulfil their purpose through their own obliteration. But there was no melancholy in this recognition, only a deeper appreciation for the craft itself, for the skill and patience that went into creating something that would exist for such a brief time. The supports we built had to be perfect precisely because they would be called upon to fail in a controlled and predictable manner. Every joint had to be strong enough to bear its load until the moment of removal, every beam positioned to release its burden cleanly when the time came. Willem had developed an almost mystical ability to sense stress in the timber framework. He would walk slowly through the tunnel, his young hands touching each beam and prop, feeling for the subtle vibrations that indicated shifting loads or developing cracks. Sometimes he would pause at a particular joint, frowning in concentration, then call for Marcus to examine the connection more closely. His intuition had saved us from several potentially dangerous situations, detecting problems before they became failures. I watched Willem's growing confidence with something like parental pride, remembering my own early days learning this craft under my father's patient guidance. The boy had the natural instincts of a true sapper. But more than that, he had the temperament for this work, the ability to maintain focus and attention through long hours of repetitive labour, the patience to wait for stone and timber to reveal their secrets rather than trying to force quick solutions. Thomas, meanwhile, had become something of a philosopher of underground work, sharing his observations about the nature of stone and earth in the quiet moments between tasks. He had spent so many years beneath the ground that he seemed to have developed a kind of geological sense, an understanding of how different types of rock behaved under stress, how water moved through limestone, how the seasonal changes above affected the subtle movements of foundation stones. One evening, as we rested after a particularly challenging day of moving massive blocks, Thomas spoke about the patience that our work required, the way it taught a man to think in terms of seasons and years rather than days and hours. The stone had been in place for generations, he reminded us, and it would yield to our efforts only according to its own deep rhythms, not according to the urgency of commanders or the impatience of soldiers. His words resonated in the warm darkness of our tunnel, mixing with the gentle sound of water trickling through the limestone around us. There was wisdom in what he said, a recognition that our work connected us to something larger and more enduring than the immediate concerns of siege warfare. We were participating in the ancient dialogue between human intelligence and natural materials, learning to work with stone and timber and earth rather than simply trying to dominate them through force. The castle foundation had taught us much about the medieval masons who had built it. Their work showed a deep understanding not just of structural engineering, but of the aesthetic possibilities of stone construction. Even below ground, where no eye would see their work, they had shaped the foundation blocks with care and precision, creating joints so perfect that the mortar between them seemed almost decorative rather than functional. We found carved marks on some of the stones, the signatures of individual masons who had shaped and placed them generations ago. Simple symbols, often just a few lines scratched into the stone with a chisel, but they spoke across the centuries of the pride these craftsmen had taken in their work. I found myself wondering about the men who had made those marks, imagining their satisfaction as they fitted each stone perfectly into place, their confidence that they were building something to last for ages. There was a kind of conversation happening between us and those long-dead builders, their craft matched against ours, their knowledge of construction balanced against our understanding of controlled destruction. We studied their work with the attention of devoted students, learning from their techniques even as we worked to undo them. Every perfectly fitted joint taught us something about the distribution of weight. Every carved stone revealed something about the tools and methods available to medieval masons. The mortar that held the foundation stones together was particularly interesting to examine. Made from lime and sand, mixed with crushed shell and bits of pottery, it had hardened over the centuries into something almost as strong as the stone itself. We had to chip it away carefully, preserving the integrity of individual blocks while gradually weakening the bonds that held the entire structure together. Marcus had developed a technique for softening the mortar using a mixture of water and wine vinegar, applied patiently over many days to gradually dissolve the lime binding. The process was slow but gentle, avoiding the shock that might alert the castle's defenders to our presence below. The dissolved mortar left a residue that had its own distinctive smell, sharp and mineral, that became part of the complex bouquet of scents that characterized our underground world. The air in the tunnel carried many different fragrances I had learned to notice: the earthy smell of damp limestone, the resinous scent of pine torch supports, the metallic tang of iron tools, the organic richness of the oil that fueled our lamps. These scents blended together into something that was uniquely ours, the atmosphere of our particular craft and workplace, as distinctive as the smell of a baker's shop or a blacksmith's forge. Sometimes, when the wind above ground shifted direction, we would catch hints of other smells drifting down through cracks in the stone above us. The smoke from cooking fires in the castle courtyard, the sweet scent of hay from the stables, occasionally even the aroma of bread baking in the castle kitchens. These reminders of life continuing normally above our heads gave our work an almost surreal quality, as if we were labouring in a parallel world that existed alongside but separate from the ordinary concerns of daily life. The isolation of our work could be profound at times. Days would pass when our only human contact was with each other, our only conversation, the technical discussions required by our craft. But rather than feeling lonely, this isolation seemed to intensify our focus, creating a kind of meditation in action that was deeply satisfying. The tunnel became a place of retreat from the confusion and conflict of the world above, a space where complex problems could be solved through patient application of skill and knowledge. We had developed our own daily rhythms, patterns of work and rest that suited the demands of our underground environment. We would begin each day by checking the stability of our supports, examining each timber beam and joint for signs of stress or movement. This inspection had an almost ritual quality, a careful attention to detail that ensured our safety and the integrity of our work. The actual excavation work followed its own natural pace, determined by the hardness of the stone, the size of the blocks we were removing, the complexity of the support work required. We had learned to read the subtle signs that told us when to push forward aggressively and when to proceed with extra caution. Sometimes the stone would yield easily, almost eagerly, to our tools. Other times it would resist stubbornly, requiring hours of patient chipping and chiseling to remove a single block. These variations in the work kept it interesting, preventing the kind of mechanical repetition that might have made our long hours underground tedious. Each day brought its own challenges and discoveries, its own small victories and occasional setbacks. The tunnel revealed its secrets gradually, teaching us about the structure above through the evidence we found in its foundations. We discovered, for instance, that the eastern wall had been built in several different phases, probably over a period of decades. The lower courses of stone were larger and more roughly shaped than those above, suggesting either different sources of material or different building techniques. The mortar composition also varied from level to level, some of it harder and more durable, some of it softer and easier to remove. These discoveries helped us understand how the wall would behave when we finally removed our supports. The older sections, with their massive stones and harder mortar, would probably hold together longer than the newer work above. This knowledge allowed Marcus to refine his calculations, adjusting our plans to account for the different structural characteristics of different parts of the wall. Willem had become fascinated by the fossils we occasionally found embedded in the limestone, ancient sea creatures preserved in stone for millions of years, now revealed in the light of our oil lamps. He would study these relics with the intensity of a scholar, marvelling at the delicate preservation of shells and coral that had lived when this land lay beneath tropical seas. There was something profound about finding these traces of ancient life so far below ground, evidence of worlds and times almost beyond imagination. The fossils reminded us that our tunnel, carved through stone that had once been a seafloor, was itself just another layer in the geological history of this place, a brief human mark on materials shaped by forces and timescales that dwarfed our own concerns. Thomas saw practical lessons in these discoveries as well. The fossils told him about the composition and hardness of different layers of stone, helping him predict how the rock would behave under different stresses. The limestone that contained the most complete fossils was usually the hardest and most durable, while stone with fewer fossils often proved softer and easier to work. As autumn deepened into winter, we began to notice subtle changes in the tunnel environment. The temperature remained constant, but the humidity increased as groundwater from winter rains began to seep through the limestone above us. The springs that flowed along our tunnel floor carried more water, creating small pools in the lower areas that reflected our lamplight like underground mirrors. These pools added their own beauty to our workspace, creating reflections that doubled the apparent size of our chambers, making the tunnel seem larger and more mysterious. The sound of dripping water became more prominent, a gentle percussion that accompanied our work and filled the silences between conversations. Sometimes when we paused in our labour to rest or to consider our next move, the sound of water seemed to become almost musical, a natural composition that matched the rhythm of our breathing and the quiet beating of our hearts. The increased humidity also brought changes to the tunnel walls, encouraging the growth of delicate mineral formations where the limestone met the flowing water. These deposits grew slowly, adding their own crystalline beauty to our underground world. In some places, the mineral formations created what looked like frozen waterfalls, stone curtains that caught and scattered our lamplight into prismatic colours. Marcus studied these formations with the eye of an engineer, understanding that they indicated specific patterns of water flow and mineral content that might affect our construction. But I found myself appreciating them simply for their beauty, for the way they transformed our working space into something that felt almost cathedral-like, a sacred place where natural forces created their own slow art. The longer we worked in the tunnel, the more it began to feel like home. We knew every irregularity in the stone floor, every beam and prop in our support system, every turn and chamber in the passages we had carved. We could navigate in complete darkness if necessary, our feet finding the safe path automatically, our hands reaching for familiar handholds without conscious thought. This intimate knowledge of our workspace created a sense of belonging that was both practical and emotional. The tunnel was ours in a way that few spaces ever become truly ours, shaped by our own hands and minds, created according to our own needs and purposes. Every stone we had removed, every beam we had positioned, every careful calculation that had guided our work, all of it combined to make this underground world uniquely our own creation. Yet even as we worked toward the completion of our undermining, I found myself thinking about what would happen to our tunnel after the wall fell. Would it simply be filled in and forgotten, becoming just another layer in the complex archaeology of this place? Would future generations, digging foundations for new buildings, discover our carefully carved passages and wonder about the men who had created them? These thoughts were not melancholy, but rather gave me a sense of participating in the long continuity of human craft and ingenuity. Our tunnel would join the countless other examples of human work that lay buried beneath the surface of the earth, evidence of problems solved and challenges met, of skills passed down through generations and refined by individual experience. The knowledge we were gaining, the techniques we were developing, the understanding we were accumulating about stone and timber and earth, all of this would outlast the tunnel itself. Some of what we learned would be passed on to other sappers, becoming part of the body of knowledge that future engineers would draw upon. Some of it would be recorded in the rough notes that Marcus kept, sketches and calculations that might someday guide other men facing similar challenges. But much of what we were learning was too subtle and experiential to be captured in words or drawings. The feel of stone under chisel, the sound that indicated a crack developing in a timber support, the almost mystical sense of structural stress that Willem was developing, these kinds of knowledge could only be passed on through direct experience, through the patient apprenticeship that connected each generation of craftsmen to those who came before and those who would follow. As winter settled over the countryside above us, bringing shorter days and longer nights, our work continued in its own seasonal rhythm. The castle walls still stood firm above us, showing no sign of the careful undermining that proceeded steadily in the darkness below. To any observer on the castle battlements, the siege camps would appear static, settled into the patient waiting that characterized winter warfare. But beneath the ground, the final phase of our work was approaching. The foundation stones that remained in place were held there mainly by our wooden supports now, the original strength of the masonry systematically weakened through months of careful removal. Soon we would need to begin the delicate process of preparing for the final collapse, the moment when timber props would be removed and centuries of construction would yield to the patient logic of our destruction. The knowledge that our work was nearing completion brought mixed feelings. There was satisfaction in approaching the successful conclusion of a difficult project, pride in the skill and patience that had brought us this far. But there was also a reluctance to see the end of this phase of our lives, to leave behind the quiet rhythms and deep satisfactions of our underground world. The tunnel had become more than just a means to an end. It had become a place of learning and discovery, a space where four very different men had found a way of working together that honoured both individual skills and collective purpose. The slow, methodical pace of our work had created its own kind of peace, a refuge from the uncertainties and conflicts of the world above. In the warm light of our oil lamps, surrounded by the familiar sounds of patient work, we continued our careful preparation for the climax that would bring both success and ending to our months of underground labour. The stone walls around us held not just the weight of the castle above, but the accumulated evidence of our own journey through patience and skill, determination and discovery, toward a conclusion that would change the world above, while leaving unchanged the deeper satisfactions of work well done and knowledge honestly earned. Each day brought us closer to that final moment, but each day also brought its own rewards, its own small discoveries and achievements. The tunnel continued to teach us, continued to challenge us, continued to provide the deep satisfaction that comes from matching human intelligence and persistence against the ancient patience of stone and earth. Our lamps burned steady and bright, casting their familiar glow on walls that had become as known to us as our own faces. The gentle sound of our tools against stone continued its quiet rhythm, marking time in our underground world where seasons changed, but the essential work remained constant, guided by knowledge as old as human civilization, and as immediate as the feeling of stone beneath our hands. The work continued, patient and sure, each careful action bringing us closer to the moment when months of construction would culminate in seconds of destruction, when the careful balance we had maintained between building and destroying would finally tip toward its inevitable conclusion. But that moment still lay ahead, still belonged to the future, while the present held only the deep satisfaction of work proceeding according to plan, of problems solved through patience and skill, of 4 men who had found, in the darkness beneath the earth, a way of working that honoured both their craft and their brotherhood. The snow began falling on the feast of St. Andrew, soft flakes that drifted down through the bare branches of the oak trees above our tunnel entrance. I remember watching from the surface as the white blanket settled over the siege camp, muffling the usual sounds of men and horses, creating a hushed quiet that seemed to extend even down into our underground world. Winter had truly arrived, bringing with it the sense that our long work beneath Château de Montclair was approaching its destined conclusion. By now, the foundation of the eastern wall hung suspended above us like a great stone ceiling, held in place by nothing more than our carefully arranged timber supports. The original strength of the medieval masonry had been methodically removed, stone by stone, over the course of nearly 6 months. What remained was an intricate wooden framework that distributed the enormous weight of the castle wall across dozens of oak beams and pine props, a temporary structure that existed only to be destroyed at the moment of our choosing. Standing in the main chamber of our tunnel system, surrounded by the geometric pattern of supports we had built, I felt a profound sense of completion mixed with anticipation. Every beam had been positioned according to Marcus's careful calculations, every joint crafted to bear its precise load, every connection designed to fail cleanly when the time came for removal. The framework above us represented months of patient engineering, the accumulated wisdom of generations of sappers, and the particular skills that the 4 of us had developed through our long collaboration beneath the earth. Thomas moved through the support structure with the confidence of absolute familiarity, his weathered hands touching each beam as he conducted his final inspection. After 30 years of this work, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect stress and weakness in timber construction. A slight deflection in a beam that might escape other eyes, a joint that carried more load than its neighbours, the subtle sounds that indicated wood beginning to compress under excessive weight, all of these spoke to him in a language learned through decades of careful attention. Willem followed close behind, his young eyes sharp for any detail that might have escaped our earlier examinations. His notebooks, filled with sketches and observations, had become a detailed record of our construction, a kind of encyclopedia of underground engineering that would serve him well in future projects. I watched him studying the support framework with the intensity of a scholar, understanding that he was not just inspecting our work, but learning lessons that would guide his own career as a sapper. Marcus stood near his rough table, reviewing the final version of the demolition plan he'd been refining for weeks. By lamplight, he traced his finger across the numbered diagram that showed the sequence in which our supports would be removed, the carefully calculated order that would bring down the wall above in a controlled collapse, rather than a chaotic avalanche. Each timber prop was numbered, each beam labelled, the entire process mapped out like a musical score written in reverse, a composition of destruction that required as much precision as any act of creation. The plan called for us to begin by removing the outermost supports, those that carried the least critical loads, working gradually inward toward the central props that bore the greatest weight. Some supports would be cut through with saws, others pulled free with ropes and levers. Still others simply kicked out of position at the crucial moment. The entire sequence would need to be completed in a matter of minutes, giving us just enough time to retreat to safety before the wall above began its inevitable fall. We had spent weeks practicing the removal sequence, timing each step, identifying potential problems, developing backup plans for contingencies that might arise. Willem had become particularly skilled at the rope work required to pull free the heavier beams, while Thomas's experience guided us in predicting exactly how each piece of the framework would behave under stress. My own role would be to coordinate the final sequence, calling out the timing that would ensure we removed supports in precisely the right order. But even as we prepared for this climactic moment, I found myself reluctant to see our underground world come to an end. The tunnel had become more than just a workplace. It had become a sanctuary, a place where time moved according to the patient rhythms of stone and timber rather than the urgent demands of warfare and politics. The gentle sound of water trickling through limestone, the warm glow of lamplight on familiar walls, the comfortable silence that could settle between four men who had learned to work together as parts of a single, more capable whole. All of this would be lost when our work was complete. There was beauty in the temporary nature of what we had created, I reflected, as I walked slowly through the passages we had carved over the past months. Like the elaborate ice sculptures that castle servants sometimes created for winter festivals, designed to delight briefly before melting away. Our tunnel and its supports existed in the knowledge of their own impermanence. This gave every detail a poignant intensity, every moment a heightened significance, knowing that soon it would all be memory. The mineral formations that had grown along our tunnel walls during the damp autumn months had continued to develop through the early winter, creating delicate crystalline structures that caught and reflected our lamplight in prismatic patterns. These natural decorations had transformed some sections of our tunnel into something that felt almost sacred, underground chapels where the patient work of water and stone had created their own quiet art. Soon these formations would be buried under tons of rubble, their beauty preserved only in our memory of this hidden place. We had decided to fire the tunnel supports just before dawn on the day after the new moon, when the darkness would provide the best concealment for our final preparations. The timing was important not just for secrecy, but for the practical requirements of our demolition plan. We would need several hours to remove all the supports in the proper sequence, and we wanted to complete our work while the castle's defenders would be least likely to detect the subtle vibrations that might precede the wall's collapse. The night before our planned demolition, we spent a final evening in the tunnel, checking and rechecking every detail of our preparations. The supports that would be removed first had been partially cut through, weakened just enough to fail quickly when the time came. The ropes and levers we would use for the heavier timbers had been positioned and tested. Our escape route had been cleared of any obstacles that might slow our retreat to safety. As we worked through these final preparations, the tunnel seemed to take on an almost ceremonial atmosphere. Each action felt weighted with significance, each familiar task performed perhaps for the last time in this place that had become so central to our lives. The lamplight that had guided our work for months cast the same warm glow, but now it illuminated spaces that we knew would soon cease to exist, familiar walls that would soon be buried beneath the ruins of the castle above. Thomas shared stories from his long career as we worked, tales of other tunnels beneath other castles, of successes and failures, of lessons learned through triumph and disaster. His voice carried the weight of accumulated experience, the wisdom of a craftsman who had spent his life mastering the subtle arts of underground warfare. These stories connected our current work to a larger tradition, reminding us that we were part of a brotherhood that extended across generations and kingdoms united by shared knowledge and common challenges. Willem listened to these stories with the attention of a devoted student, understanding that he was hearing the kind of wisdom that could only be gained through years of practical experience. His questions showed how much he had learned during our months underground, how his understanding of the work had deepened from simple, technical knowledge to the kind of intuitive grasp that comes only through repeated practice and careful observation. Marcus, meanwhile, made final notes in his journal, recording observations and insights that might be useful for future projects. His systematic approach to documentation had created a detailed record of our methods, a kind of technical manual that could guide other engineers facing similar challenges. But I could see in his careful writing something beyond mere professional duty, a recognition that he was recording not just techniques and calculations, but memories of a shared experience that had meaning beyond its practical applications. As for myself, I found that I was trying to memorize every detail of our underground world, to preserve in memory the texture of limestone walls, the particular quality of light created by oil lamps in enclosed spaces, the sound of 4 men breathing quietly in the intimate darkness. These sensory memories would outlast any written record, carrying forward into the future the immediate physical reality of our months beneath the earth. The final night in our tunnel passed slowly, marked by the familiar sounds that had accompanied our work for so many months. The gentle drip of water from limestone ceiling, the soft whisper of air moving through passages we had carved, the occasional creak of timber supports adjusting to their loads, all of these created a quiet symphony that had become the soundtrack of our underground life. Soon these sounds would be replaced by the crash of falling stone, but for now they continued their gentle rhythm, marking time in a world that existed apart from the urgent concerns of siege and conquest. When dawn finally began to lighten the sky above, we made our final preparations with the careful deliberation that had characterized all our work. Each man knew his role in the sequence of demolition. Each step had been planned and practiced, each contingency considered and prepared for. The months of patient work had led to this moment, when theory would become reality, when careful calculation would be tested against the unforgiving physics of stone and timber. The first supports came out easily, removed according to plan without unexpected difficulties. These outer props had carried relatively light loads, serving mainly to distribute weight evenly across the framework rather than bearing critical structural responsibilities. As we pulled them free and set them aside, the remaining supports adjusted slightly, taking up the redistributed loads with small creaks and sighs that Thomas interpreted like words in a familiar language. Working inward toward the more heavily loaded supports, we maintained the careful timing that Marcus had calculated, allowing the framework to adjust gradually to each change rather than shocking it with sudden alterations. Willem's rope work was flawless, pulling free beam after beam with precisely the right amount of force. Never too much, never too little. The boy had developed an almost intuitive sense of how timber behaved under stress, reading the subtle signs that indicated when a support was ready to be removed. As we approached the central supports, those massive oak beams that carried the greatest portion of the wall's weight, the atmosphere in the tunnel grew more intense. These final props represented the margin between success and disaster, between a controlled collapse and an unpredictable failure that might bring down the tunnel roof upon us. Every cut had to be precise, every movement calculated, every decision based on accumulated knowledge rather than hope or guess. The sound of our saws cutting through seasoned oak seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space of the tunnel, each stroke echoing off limestone walls that would soon be buried beneath tons of rubble. The sawdust fell in small piles around our feet, fragrant with the resin and life that the timber had carried from forest to foundation. Soon these beams that had supported the castle wall would become kindling for someone's fire, their structural purpose transformed into simple fuel for warmth and light. One by one, the central supports yielded to our careful work. Each beam that was cut through or pulled free brought us closer to the critical moment when the remaining props would no longer be able to bear the load above. We could feel the increasing stress in the framework around us, hear the small sounds that indicated timber compressing under growing weight, see the slight deflections that showed how loads were shifting as supports were removed. Thomas called the final sequence, his experienced voice guiding us through the last critical minutes of our demolition. The remaining supports had to be removed in precisely the right order, with exactly the right timing to ensure that the wall above would fall outward rather than inward, that the collapse would be complete rather than partial, that we would have time to reach safety before the destruction began. The last support beam came free with a sound like a tree falling in a distant forest, a deep groan of stressed wood finally releasing its burden. For a moment, the tunnel was filled with absolute silence, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Then, with a rumble that seemed to come from the very bones of the mountain, the collapse began. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard, deeper than thunder, more sustained than any earthly noise. It was the sound of centuries giving way to moments, of patient construction yielding to patient destruction, of stone and mortar that had stood firm for generations, finally accepting the inevitability of their fall. The walls of our tunnel shook with vibrations that seemed to travel through solid rock, carrying the news of destruction through the limestone bones of the earth. We ran through the escape passage we had prepared, our feet finding the familiar path even as dust began to filter down from the ceiling above. Behind us, the main chamber of our tunnel was filling with debris as the castle wall collapsed into the void we had created beneath its foundation. The framework we had built so carefully was being crushed beneath the weight it had held for so many months, oak beams and pine props disappearing beneath an avalanche of dressed stone and ancient mortar. The sound continued for what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only minutes, a sustained roar of destruction that gradually diminished to the smaller sounds of individual stones settling into their new positions. When we finally emerged from our escape tunnel into the pale light of winter dawn, the eastern wall of Château de Montclair was gone, reduced to a slope of rubble that extended from the castle's foundation to the edge of the moat below. Standing in the cold morning air, breathing deeply of the sharp winter atmosphere, after months in the enclosed world of our tunnel, I felt a complex mixture of triumph and loss. We had succeeded completely in our objective, bringing down the wall with precisely the kind of controlled collapse that Marcus had calculated. The gap in the castle's defences was total and irreparable, making the fortress indefensible and ensuring that the siege would soon end in our Lord's favour. But success brought its own melancholy. The tunnel that had been our world for so many months was gone, buried beneath the ruins of the wall we had brought down. The careful framework we had built, the passages we had carved, the spaces where we had learned to work together as craftsmen and companions, all of it had been destroyed in the moments of our greatest professional triumph. Willem stood beside me, staring at the rubble that covered our tunnel entrance, his young face reflecting something of what I felt. The boy had learned more than engineering techniques during our months underground. He had discovered the deep satisfactions that come from patient, skilled work, from problems solved through persistence and intelligence rather than force and speed. The tunnel had been his classroom and his home, the place where he'd grown from apprentice to craftsman. Thomas seemed less affected by the destruction, perhaps because his long experience had taught him that this was the natural ending to such projects. He examined the collapsed wall with professional interest, noting how the stones had fallen, observing which parts of our demolition plan had worked exactly as intended, and which had produced slightly different results than expected. For him, each project was both an end in itself and a source of knowledge for future work. Marcus was already making notes, sketching the pattern of rubble, recording observations that would help him refine his techniques for future tunnels beneath future walls. His systematic mind was transforming the destruction into data, analysing the success of our methods, identifying improvements that might be made in similar projects. The engineer in him was already moving beyond this accomplishment toward the next challenge, the next opportunity to apply accumulated knowledge to new problems. As for myself, I found that I was already beginning the process of transforming immediate experience into lasting memory. The physical reality of our tunnel was gone, but the knowledge we had gained, the skills we had developed, the understanding we had accumulated about stone and timber and earth, all of this would remain. The months beneath Château de Montclair had changed us, teaching us not just about the techniques of siege warfare, but about the deeper satisfactions of work that honoured both individual skill and collective purpose. The siege ended 3 days later, when the castle's garrison, faced with an indefensible position, negotiated terms of surrender. The defenders marched out with honour, their banners flying, their weapons bright in the winter sun. The formalities of medieval warfare proceeded according to ancient custom, but everyone understood that the real victory had been won in darkness, through months of patient work that few would ever see or fully comprehend. Lord Geoffrey was generous in his praise for our achievement, understanding that the fall of Montclair had been accomplished through engineering rather than valour, through intelligence rather than force of arms. But his words of commendation, though sincere, seemed to belong to a different world from the quiet satisfactions we had found in our underground work. The true reward for our labour was not praise or payment, but the knowledge that we had mastered a difficult craft, that we had solved complex problems through patience and skill. In the weeks that followed, as the army prepared to move on to new campaigns and different challenges, I found myself thinking often about the tunnel we had built and destroyed. The physical structure was gone, buried beneath tons of rubble, but it continued to exist in memory, in the detailed knowledge of every passage and chamber, every support beam and carefully carved stone. The tunnel lived on in the skills we had developed, the techniques we had refined, the understanding we had gained about the patient arts of underground warfare. Willem asked me once, as we travelled toward our next assignment, whether I regretted the destruction of something we had worked so long to create. The question showed the depth of his thinking about our craft, his recognition that there was something poignant about building in order to destroy, about creating beauty that was designed to be temporary. I told him that I felt no regret, only a deeper appreciation for the craft itself. The tunnel had fulfilled its purpose exactly as intended, succeeding not despite its destruction, but through its destruction. Like a seed that must die to become a plant, our underground work had achieved its meaning through its own ending, transforming months of patient construction into moments of decisive change. The knowledge we had gained would outlast any physical structure we might have built. The techniques we had developed would be passed on to other sappers, becoming part of the accumulated wisdom that each generation of craftsmen inherited from those who came before. The understanding we had developed about stone and timber, about patience and precision, about the satisfaction that comes from work well done, all of this would continue long after the last stones of our tunnel had settled into their final positions. Years later, when I had become the master sapper, training younger men in the arts, I had learned beneath Montclair, I would often tell them about that winter morning when centuries of construction yielded to months of patient undermining. I would describe the sound of falling stone, the sight of a great wall reduced to rubble, the complex mixture of triumph and loss that comes with the successful completion of any significant work. But more often I would tell them about the quieter satisfactions of our underground world, about the patient rhythm of chisel and hammer, about the gentle light of oil lamps on familiar walls, about the deep pleasure that comes from working with skilled companions toward a common goal. These were the lessons that could not be learned from books or lectures, the kind of knowledge that could only be gained through experience, through the patient apprenticeship that connected each craftsman to the long tradition of those who had worked with stone and timber before him. The tunnel beneath Château de Montclair was gone, but its memory lived on in every careful cut I made in future projects, in every support beam I positioned, in every moment when I paused to listen to what the stone was telling me about stress and strength, patience and time. The months we had spent in that underground world had become part of who I was, part of how I understood the world and my place in it. Sometimes in quiet moments I would close my eyes and let my mind drift back to that limestone sanctuary, remembering the sound of water trickling through stone, the warm glow of lamplight on tunnel walls, the comfortable silence that could settle between men who had learned to work together as parts of something larger than themselves. These memories were more enduring than any physical structure, more valuable than any treasure we might have discovered in our digging. The earth still speaks to me in whispers, carrying messages written in the patient language of stone and time, telling stories that connect the work of my hands to the great, slow processes that shape the world around us. The tunnel beneath Montclair was just one chapter in that longer story, one moment in the endless conversation between human intelligence and natural materials. But it was the chapter that taught me how to listen, how to understand, how to find in the darkness beneath the earth a kind of illumination that no surface light could provide. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest gift of our months underground, not the successful completion of a military objective, but the discovery of work that connected us to something larger and more enduring than the immediate concerns of war and conquest. The tunnel had been our classroom and our sanctuary, the place where we learned that the deepest satisfactions come not from quick victories or easy accomplishments, but from patient engagement with problems that require all of our skill, all of our knowledge, all of our capacity for sustained attention and careful work. The memory of that underground world continues to guide me decades later, reminding me that the most important work is often done in darkness, away from the attention of those who value only what they can see and understand quickly. The tunnel beneath Château de Montclair taught me that true craftsmanship creates its own light, that patient work develops its own rhythms, that the collaboration of skilled individuals can create something greater than any of them could achieve alone. These lessons, learned in the gentle glow of oil lamps surrounded by limestone walls, continue to illuminate every project I undertake, every problem I face, every moment when I must choose between the quick solution and the patient one, between work that satisfies immediate needs and work that honours the deeper requirements of craft and conscience. The tunnel is gone, but its teaching remains, whispering still in the language of stone and time, reminding me that the earth holds all the wisdom we need, if only we learn how to listen. Now for more historical context. Sappers in medieval warfare, masters of siege and subterfuge. The evolution of underground warfare. The term sapper derives from the French word sapper, meaning to undermine, and these specialized warriors became indispensable figures in medieval siege warfare. Far from the explosive experts of later centuries, medieval sappers were master diggers, engineers, and tacticians who wielded pickaxe and shovel as skillfully as knights wielded sword and lance. Their primary mission was to breach the seemingly impregnable walls of castles and fortified cities through methodical excavation and structural undermining. Medieval sappers emerged as a distinct military specialty during the 11th and 12th centuries, as castle construction became increasingly sophisticated and traditional assault methods proved inadequate against thick stone walls and strategic defensive positions. These men combined the skills of miners, carpenters, and military engineers working in cramped, dangerous conditions beneath enemy fortifications to achieve what battering rams and siege towers often could not. The art of undermining. The fundamental technique employed by medieval sappers involved digging tunnels beneath castle walls or towers, then systematically weakening the foundations until the structure above collapsed. This process, known as undermining or sapping, required extensive knowledge of soil composition, structural engineering, and military timing. Sappers would begin their work at a safe distance from the target fortification, often starting their tunnels from within temporary wooden shelters called cats or penthouses that protected them from defensive fire. The tunnel would be carefully excavated, with wooden supports installed to prevent premature collapse. Upon reaching the foundation of the target wall, sappers would create a large chamber and fill it with combustible materials, typically timber, straw, and pig fat, which burned particularly hot and long. The climactic moment came when the supporting materials were ignited. As the fire consumed the wooden props holding up the tunnel, the chamber would collapse, taking with it the foundation of the wall above. If executed properly, entire sections of castle walls would tumble into the resulting crater, creating breaches through which attacking forces could pour. The Siege of Rochester Castle, 1215. One of the most documented examples of medieval sapping occurred during King John's siege of Rochester Castle in 1215. The massive Norman keep, with walls 12 feet thick, seemed impregnable to conventional assault. However, John's sappers, working under the direction of experienced military engineers, began tunnelling beneath the castle's great tower. The operation took several weeks of dangerous excavation work. Sappers dug through chalk and clay, constantly at risk from cave-ins and sorties by the castle's defenders, who attempted to locate and destroy the tunnel through countermining operations. When the tunnel was complete, the chamber beneath the tower's corner was filled with timber and fat from 40 pigs, a detail recorded in the royal accounts demonstrating the scale of resources devoted to such operations. The fire burned for hours, and when the supports finally gave way, the entire southeastern corner of the great tower collapsed in a tremendous crash that could be heard for miles. The breach allowed John's forces to storm the castle, though the defenders retreated to the remaining portion of the keep and continued their resistance for several more days. The Siege of Carcassonne, 1209. During the Albigensian Crusade, the Siege of Carcassonne in 1209 demonstrated both the effectiveness of sapping and the sophisticated countermeasures defenders could employ. The Crusader forces, led by Simon de Montfort, found the city's double walls and numerous towers resistant to conventional assault methods. Sappers began work on multiple tunnel systems, attempting to undermine different sections of the outer wall simultaneously. However, the defenders of Carcassonne, well versed in siege warfare, employed counter-sappers who dug their own tunnels to intercept the attackers' excavations. These underground encounters led to brutal hand-to-hand combat in narrow, poorly lit tunnels, a form of warfare that required exceptional courage and skill. The defenders also used a technique called listening, placing bowls of water or stretched parchments on the ground to detect the vibrations caused by enemy digging. When tunnels were detected, they would dig countermines to break into the enemy works, then engage in underground battles or attempt to flood or smoke out the sappers. Despite these defensive measures, the crusading sappers eventually succeeded in undermining a section of Carcassonne's outer wall. The threat of complete encirclement and the successful breach led to the city's surrender, demonstrating how the mere threat of effective sapping could influence the outcome of a siege. The Siege of Château Gaillard, 1203 to 1204. Perhaps the most famous example of medieval siege warfare involving sappers was Philip Augustus's capture of Château Gaillard Richard the Lionheart's supposedly impregnable fortress overlooking the Seine. The castle's innovative design, with its concentric defences and strategic position, had been specifically planned to resist conventional siege techniques. French sappers, working through the harsh winter of 1203 to 1204, undertook multiple tunnel operations against different sections of the castle's defences. The most crucial work involved undermining the outer bailey's wall, a process that took months of careful excavation through the chalky rock upon which the castle stood. The sappers faced unique challenges at Château Gaillard, including the need to work in freezing conditions and the constant threat of sorties by the castle's garrison. The defenders, commanded by Roger de Lacy, attempted various countermeasures, including throwing down burning materials and attempting to locate tunnel entrances. When the undermining was complete, the resulting collapse created a breach large enough for assault troops to enter the outer bailey. This success allowed the French to establish a foothold within the castle's defences, ultimately leading to the fall of this seemingly impregnable fortress and marking a significant victory for Philip Augustus in his conflict with the Angevin Empire. Defensive countermeasures and the arms race. The success of sappers inevitably led to the development of sophisticated defensive countermeasures. Castle builders began incorporating features specifically designed to thwart underground attacks. These included the construction of deep foundation ditches filled with water, which made tunnelling extremely difficult, and the use of especially hard stone foundations that resisted excavation. Countermining became a specialised defensive art in its own right. Defending forces would employ their own sappers to dig tunnels aimed at intercepting enemy excavations. These underground encounters often resulted in fierce battles, fought in cramped, dark conditions, with swords, daggers, and mining tools. Defenders also developed techniques for detecting enemy tunnelling operations, using everything from stretched animal skins that would vibrate when placed on the ground, to bowls of water that would ripple when underground digging occurred nearby. Some castles incorporated listening galleries, specifically constructed chambers within the walls where guards could detect the sounds of enemy digging. The famous Creak des Chevaliers in Syria included such features, demonstrating how architectural innovation responded to the threat posed by sappers. The tools and techniques of the trade. Medieval sappers employed a variety of specialised tools adapted for their unique form of warfare. Beyond the basic pickaxes and shovels, they used narrow-bladed spades designed for working in confined spaces, wooden props of various sizes for tunnel support, and specialised baskets for removing excavated soil quietly and efficiently. The excavated earth presented its own challenges, as large quantities of soil and rock had to be disposed of without alerting the defenders to the location of tunnel entrances. Sappers developed techniques for scattering this material or concealing it within existing fortifications built by the besieging army. Ventilation in the tunnels was a constant concern, addressed through the construction of concealed air shafts or the use of bellows systems to force fresh air into the workings. The risk of tunnel collapse was ever present, requiring sappers to become skilled in the use of wooden supports and the reading of soil conditions. The decline and legacy. The effectiveness of medieval sappers reached its peak during the 12th and 13th centuries, but their importance began to decline with the introduction of gunpowder artillery in the 14th and 15th centuries. Cannons could breach walls more quickly and with less risk than tunnelling operations, though sapping continued to be used in certain circumstances well into the early modern period. The legacy of medieval sappers extended far beyond their immediate military impact. Their techniques influenced the development of mining engineering, and their organisational methods contributed to the evolution of military engineering as a professional discipline. The courage and specialised skills required for sapping also contributed to the development of elite military units, prefiguring the specialized engineer corps of later armies. The underground warfare pioneered by medieval sappers established principles that would influence military engineering for centuries to come. Their combination of technical expertise, physical courage, and tactical innovation represented one of the most sophisticated responses to the challenge of medieval fortification, proving that even the mightiest walls could be brought low by patience, skill, and determination applied from below.